Welcome to our last lesson for Greek Grammar Semester 2. And I just want to say congratulations to those of you who've reached this point. You have persevered in your studies, and we have come to the very last lesson and last chapter in your textbook. We're coming to the subject of infinitives. And as I think of this last chapter in our textbook by Ray Summers, I think there was real wisdom on his part in saving this subject for last, because infinitives are not only very flexible and diverse in usage, but they can be very difficult to grasp for English readers because the Greek usage and idiom is quite different from our English infinitives, as we'll see. Now, oftentimes they're very similar, but it's the range of exceptions and diversity of usage in Greek that make them somewhat difficult to grasp. And so that's our topic for this last lesson. Now, as we begin, we have to look not first at the Greek infinitive, but understand what an English infinitive is. And so let's review that so that we can compare it with Greek infinitives. In English, to form an infinitive, we simply take the word to and we add a verb concept to it. So it's to plus a verb concept or verb. For example, we say this oftentimes: to err is human, to forgive is divine. And in this sentence, to err is human, to forgive is divine, to err and to forgive are both noun phrases that function as subjects in the sentence, not verbs, even though the idea of erring or forgiving are action verbs. But here they're actually put in the construction of an infinitive and used substantively as the subjects of the sentence, as a noun phrase. Even though human and divine are actually adjectives here, they're functioning as predicate adjectives in this sentence with the being verb is supplied, found there twice. And so thus you can see why the infinitive is sometimes called a verbal noun from this example. Even in Greek, we call it a verbal noun. And as we'll see, the Greek infinitive often functions this same way as you see in this English sentence. But, as I already said, it's capable of a much greater breadth of usage than just this simple English example. And that's what makes infinitives sometimes very difficult to grasp for English speakers, because it can function in Greek as a noun, as an adverb, as a participle, as an adjective, and even as a verb. So it has quite a range of usage, very similar to what we already learned with participles. You will recall when it comes to our study of participles that we learned they were verbal adjectives, in the sense that they are verbal because they're based on a verb or verb concept, like run, hit, forgive, or sleep. But the participle can also function as an adjective in the sense that it can modify a noun, like the word sleeping in this sentence. The sleeping giant has been awakened. Well, similarly, when it comes to infinitives, they function as verbal nouns in the sense, or that's what they're called, verbal nouns, because they can participate in some of the features of the verb and some of the features of the noun. Now, I should also clarify that the two parts of speech that are called verbals rather than verbs are infinitives and participles. You should know that. They're not the same as verbs, though they can function verbally. They are not finite verbs. In fact, that's where the word infinitive comes from. It's this idea of being infinite or non-finite. When there is a subject and a finite verb is combined with it, normally that forms a complete sentence, where the action of the verb is limited by its subject. Let me give you an example of this. Let's take this sentence: the giant sleeps. The action of sleeps here is finite or limited because it has a subject, namely giant. So according to this sentence, the giant and not someone else is doing the sleeping. But let's take a non-finite verb, and like an infinitive, to sleep, or even a participle, sleeping. Those don't have the subject built right into the word itself in their forms, infinitive or participle. So the subject has to be supplied somewhere else in the sentence in order to limit the action of the verbal concept or the verb itself. So that's what distinguishes infinitives and participles as not being finite verbs. A finite verb is one which has the subject built right into it, and thus verbs themselves are called finite verbs, and infinitives and participles are verbal parts of speech, to be technically correct. Now that we've had our introduction to infinitives, let's move on to the subject of morphology, and we're looking at a paradigm of the different forms of infinitives as they occur in the New Testament. Infinitives occur about 2,300 times in the New Testament, and you see future listed there. You might get the impression from this list of paradigm options here, or form options, I should say, in this paradigm, you might get the impression that there are just as many future infinitives as there are present or aorist or perfect. In fact, out of the 2,300 times that infinitives occur total in the New Testament, there are only 5 uses of the future infinitive. 4 of those occur in the book of Acts, and they're all forms of a me put in the infinitive. And then there's one other use outside of Acts. So that's your entire future usage. So usually people are not even required to know what the future forms of the infinitive are. Also, when it comes to the perfect infinitive, out of the 2,300 total occurrences in the New Testament of infinitives, the perfect infinitive form occurs only 49 times. So about 98% of infinitives are going to be either present or aorist tense, and a slight majority are going to be aorist tense versus perfect or present tense rather. So what this means is there are no imperfect or pluperfect forms for infinitives. Now also, as you look at this paradigm, notice the endings. The present active forms all end in ein, or epsilon, iota, nu, and second aorist, by the way. But otherwise, the rest all end in alpha, iota, I, the diphthong I. So if you see something that you think might be a verb, but it ends with ein or I, you're probably dealing with an infinitive then at that point. So I just want to give you a little tip or clue when it comes to these forms, that it's not as much memorization as it may at first appear. Now let's take the present active luein. How would we translate that? Well, apart from a context, we can't say definitively, but a simple gloss would be simply too loose. Or the perfect middle, or excuse me, present middle infinitive, luesthai, we would translate that too loose for himself, or herself, or itself, etc. When it comes to the present passive infinitive, luesthai, same form shared with the middle, so know that with that form it could be either middle voice or passive voice. You would translate that to be loosed if it was passive. Now the aorist tense and present tense normally have very little difference, if any, in translation. It doesn't come out, in other words, the tense difference in our translations. However, just keep in mind that when it comes to tense differences, there is a difference in aspect, that is the viewpoint of the writer or speaker. But when it comes to translating the actual infinitive word in those tense forms, there's often very little difference between aorist and present tense, because when it comes to time, time is not inherent to infinitives like it is to indicative mood verbs. Now, as we think of the perfect tense infinitives on the bottom of this paradigm, these may be translated to have loosed. So you may want to incorporate that past time idea into the infinitive translation if past time is warranted by the context. If not, it could be present in terms of time with the idea of a present state coming out in your translation more. However, in verses in the New Testament, you'll see that the translation of infinitives varies so much from just these simple glosses that I've offered you. But just be aware that there's a great range and variety of usage, as we'll see in just a moment. And so the translation could vary quite a bit from these simple examples I've given you. Now you can also see from this paradigm that when it comes to infinitives, they have tense and they have voice. But what they don't have is mood, they don't have gender, they don't have number, they don't have case, like a participle would have tense, voice, case, gender, number. But let's clarify something when it comes to mood. Sometimes you'll have Greek grammarians say, when it comes to parsing a participle, that for the mood, you just want to supply participle mood. Those who recommend that also say, when it comes to infinitives, to put down for your parsing, when it comes to mood, put down infinitive mood. I do not recommend that because technically participles and infinitives don't have mood. And so I would recommend not getting in the habit of doing that. So for example, when it comes to parsing, when it asks for part of speech, you'll put infinitive in this case for infinitives. When it comes to case, gender, person, number, for each of those you'll put not applicable. However, when it comes to voice, you have the option of active, middle, or passive voice. When it comes to tense, you have the option of present tense, future, aorist, or first and second aorist to be precise, because there's two forms for the aorist, but they function the same way. Or you have the perfect tense as an option. But when it comes to mood, when you're parsing, just simply put not applicable. Do not put infinitive mood. I'd recommend that you don't get in the habit of doing that. That way you'll keep straight in your mind that infinitives don't have a mood. Now let's look at some characteristics of infinitives and see how they function even like a verb. Remember that infinitives are technically verbal nouns, and that means they're hybrid in the sense that they sometimes function like a noun and sometimes they have verbal characteristics. And so when it comes to functioning like a verb or being like a verb, we know that they have tense and they have voice, but they don't have person, number, and mood. So like verbs, infinitives will also have aspect because they have a tense form. For example, the present tense form of an infinitive will portray imperfective aspect or action that's viewed proximate and internal to the action of the verb that lies behind the infinitive. Likewise, the aorist tense infinitive will be portraying subjectively an action that's viewed perfectively and holistically. And the perfect tense infinitive will view the action as stative. Now keep in mind that time of action is not something that's built into the infinitive or even the kind of action. That's determined by the context, especially with the use of prepositions in conjunction with infinitives, as well as the lexical meaning of the verb that lies behind the infinitive. And in addition to those two other characteristics, infinitives are unlike a verb in this sense that they're not conjugated. As we saw in the previous paradigm slides, that there were no various conjugated forms. You just had the one form for tense and for voice. And so that really cuts down on the number of forms, fortunately, because infinitives are not conjugated. They can also take a direct object and be modified by an adverb, as we'll see. And they're negated by the word may, not oo, because "u" is used as the word of negation for indicative mood verbs, whereas "may" is used for all non-indicatives, and that would include infinitives and participles. Likewise, they're like verbs in the sense that the subject of the infinitive, because it's not built in, but when one is supplied in the context, you'll see that that word is going to be in the accusative case. We call that the subject accusative. And the infinitive, being a verbal noun, can also function like a noun. It can take an article, which, by the way, when it does, in about 300 uses out of 2,300 times the infinitive occurs. So in the vast minority of cases, it's going to have an article. But when it does have an article, it's always going to be neuter and singular in these three forms: ta, tu, or to. Likewise, it can have a variety of different case functions based on that article or other words in the context that supply a case. And it can be modified by an adjective, and it can occur after a preposition. So these are its noun-like characteristics. Now, going back to our paradigm for infinitive forms, for all the different tense forms as well as voices, keep in mind that for this paradigm, all these forms are infinitives that are based on the verbs of the omega and me conjugations, which we've learned. But infinitives that are based on contract verbs are a special case of infinitives in terms of how they're formed and how they will be spelled, therefore. So we need to review those for a moment. Now, here are the different combinations for contract verbs. You'll recall that with contract verbs, they have a stem ending in a short vowel, as indicated along the far left-hand column there by epsilon, alpha, and omega with the hyphenation after them. When these short vowels combine with a connecting vowel or diphthong, they contract into a new vowel or diphthong for the final ending of each particular verb. So, for example, let's take the word luane, the present active infinitive form in our paradigm that we just looked at. The connecting vowel is epsilon, and when it meets with another epsilon in the ending n, epsilon nu, then it contracts into an epsilon iota diphthong. And then, of course, you attach the nu again, and that's how you have the ending for the infinitive form luane. Instead of the verb luo, we have present active indicative verb luo, we have luane. Now let's look at some examples for contract verbs that end in epsilon, alpha, and omicron. Starting with one that ends with epsilon, poieo. You take off the omega ending, and you have poi, poie. It ends in an epsilon, a short vowel. And so here we have an example of a contract verb, present tense, active voice form, but how do we end up with the poiein final form for present active infinitive? Well, it goes through a contraction, and here's the process. So on this second line here, you have poie plus an epsilon, and when you combine the epsilon and the epsilon, you can see from the chart that it actually forms the diphthong epsilon iota, and that forms poie. And then that combines with the ending, the epsilon nu ending, and again, when you have the epsilon plus the a diphthong, it remains an a diphthong, and thus you have poie. You reattach the nu ending, and you have poiein. And so that is an example for the epsilon short vowel ending of a contract infinitive. And here's an example of a contract verb whose vowel stem ends in a short alpha short A sound. Agapao is our word. Now starting on the left, you have an alpha combined with an epsilon, and according to our chart, that ends up being an alpha. And then in our last line here, you take the agapa that was formed from the previous combination or contraction. You still have to attach the N, epsilon nu ending. And so the alpha combined with an epsilon remains an alpha. And thus the final form of this contract verb is agapan. So as a present active indicative verb, you would have agapao, but when you see agapan, that would be the present active infinitive form. Now agapan as a present active infinitive looks quite a bit different from luain, the present active infinitive form that we saw in our paradigm. But just keep in mind, if you see a word like agapan, it's infinitive because it is a contract verb, even though it looks quite different from the standard paradigm present active endings of ain. And here's our final example of an omicron short vowel ending to the stem of a contract verb. In this case, it's pleirao. And here you've got omicron, and that's going to combine with the epsilon to form the omicron upsilon diphthong, pleiru. But then again, you still have an epsilon nu ending. And so when that combines the epsilon with the omicron upsilon diphthong, you end up with the omicron upsilon diphthong still. You attach the nu ending and you end up with pleirun for the present active infinitive form of the contract verb pleirao. And again, pleirun, the final form of the present active infinitive here, looks quite a bit different from our standard paradigm present active infinitive luain. So just be aware that sometimes with these contract verbs, their infinitives look quite a bit different from the standard paradigm form that you have memorized or are referring to in your charts. Now moving on from morphology, let's look at the usage of different infinitives in different contexts. I should state at the outset, as we look at these various usages, number one, all of these examples that I'm going to be explaining to you in these slides are also found in the condensed form or summary form in one document on our Moodle course website. And so you don't have to write all this down. In fact, I would recommend that you print out that summary, and if you want to take any additional notes, you could just write them right on the printout. But also I should mention here that when it comes to the different uses of the infinitive, as I mentioned previously at the outset of this lesson, infinitives are quite diverse in terms of their usage, and being a verbal noun, they are hybrid. They can sometimes function like a verb, sometimes like a noun. So we're going to see that they can function not only as a verb, but adverbially. And usually these examples are broken down as the majority of uses of the infinitive are going to be adverbial. We'll get to verb usage, which is actually rare. Pure verb usage for the infinitive is very rare. But there are a number of adverbial uses, as we'll see here, with the complementary usage. And they are adverbial in this sense. I should explain this, because as infinitives, in certain contexts, the infinitive is related to a main or controlling verb in the verse, and they work in cooperation with one another. They're related to one another, the infinitive and the main verb in a verse. So for example, we have here the complementary use of the infinitive as an adverbial infinitive. And when you see these kinds of constructions, you'll see that certain finite verbs need to be completed by another verb to form a complete thought, and sometimes it's the infinitive rather than another verb that complements or completes the verbal idea of the main controlling verb. And oftentimes you're going to see a few common verbs that are used in a sentence as the main verbs. When you've got a complementary infinitive, you'll see verbs like archemai, I am beginning, or day, it is necessary, dunamai, I am able, and mello, I am about to. So here's one example of a complementary adverbial infinitive from Matthew 4, verse 17. Jesus began to preach and to say. Here we have the simple infinitive translation, just to along with the infinitive in both to preach and to say. So nothing complicated in terms of how to translate this particular verse, but you've got two infinitives here, and they are complementing erxata, which is the aorist indicative form of archo, began, as it's translated here. So both to preach and to say complement erxata, or the aorist indicative form of archo. I should say that this complementary adverbial use of the infinitive is something that's very common in the New Testament in Koine Greek. Another very common type of adverbial infinitive is the purpose infinitive. The purpose infinitive communicates the goal or intent of an action expressed by the main and controlling verb in a sentence. This often occurs after verbs of motion, sending, giving, and choosing. For example, we've got Matthew 5, verse 17. Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." And so here in Matthew 5:17, you've got two aorist active infinitives of kataluo and plerao. And this can be translated, could be, if you wanted to, rather than the simple infinitive to plus the infinitive here, you could translate it as a purpose infinitive with the words in order to, or in some other context, in order that. So that's the purpose infinitive, very common and very important, by the way. One of the main uses of infinitives is the purpose. Now, a similar but different use of the infinitive is what's called the result infinitive. This differs from purpose in that a purpose infinitive indicates an intended result, whereas the result infinitive normally indicates what has actually and already resulted, not just what was intended. Now, the result infinitive can be expressing the intended result that actually occurs, whether that result was something intentional or unintentional. This is relatively common, this use of the infinitive, the result infinitive. I would say it's not as common as the purpose infinitive or even the complementary infinitive we saw in the two previous examples. But let's look at an example of the result infinitive in Luke 5, verse 7, where Peter and the disciples are told to go out on the boat and cast the net over the side, because Peter had said, "Lord, we fished all night, we didn't find anything." Jesus says, "At my command, I want you to do this." So Peter does it, reluctantly, but he does it. And sure enough, there are fish in abundance, and they fill the boat. So verse 7 says, "They came and filled both boats so that they began to sink." Now the word for sink here, the verb, is bouthidzo, and here we have bouthidzesthai as the present passive infinitive form of bouthidzo. And this is a result infinitive rather than a purpose infinitive, because Peter didn't go out with the purpose of filling the boat to the point of sinking or beginning to sink. Now, you also see here in this sentence in Greek that the subordinating conjunction hosta is used right before the infinitive. And hosta is often translated that or so that, and that enhances the idea here of this being a result infinitive. And sometimes you may not have a word like hosta, but it is common that that occurs. with an infinitive to form the result infinitive. Now, when you see a passage where you're not sure if it's purpose infinitive or result infinitive, just try to supply the words in the context so that, or so as to, or even with the result that. And if those words tend to fit in the context, then you know you're dealing with a result infinitive. And fourthly, when it comes to adverbial infinitives, we have the temporal infinitive. The temporal infinitive is sometimes called an infinitive of time, but it's the same idea as the word temporal indicates. This type of infinitive answers the question of when the action of the main or controlling verb occurs. So the temporal use of the infinitive conveys to the reader that the action of the infinitive occurs either before, during, or after the action of the main verb. The time of the action of the infinitive is not based on the tense form of the infinitive, but on contextual factors, such as its relation to the main verb and the use of various prepositions. Like participles, the infinitive's time of action is relative to that of the main verb and not vice versa. That's a very important point that you want to always remember. Now, as I said, when it comes to the temporal infinitives, sometimes they indicate prior time. So here you have an adverbial infinitive that's temporal, indicating previous time. And in these instances, oftentimes you'll see the preposition meta, which is usually translated after, combined with the infinitive. So the word meta is translated after, and it indicates that the action of the infinitive occurs not after the main verb, and this is somewhat confusing, but the action of the infinitive occurs before that of the main verb. So in other words, the infinitive is qualifying the action of the main verb in terms of the time of the main verb. So here's one example that I think is quite clear, Acts 1, verse 3, where it says, "To whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering." So notice it answers the question of when. When did he present himself alive? It was after his suffering. So in other words, his suffering was previous to presenting himself alive at the beginning of the book of Acts. We know that he was going to ascend to heaven shortly there in the context of Acts chapter 1. But first he suffered on the cross, then he rose from the dead, then he was with them 40 days, being seen by them multiple times, many infallible proofs, and this all occurred after his suffering, is the idea. But you can see in the Greek sentence of Acts 1:3, the preposition meta, along with the infinitive pathein, which is the aorist active infinitive form of pasco. Sometimes the temporal adverbial infinitive will indicate contemporaneous time. In this case, it will use the preposition en along with the article to in the dative case there, combined with the infinitive. And so the action of the infinitive in this situation occurs simultaneously or at the same time as the action of the main controlling verb, and is usually translated with the words as, while, or when. For example, in Matthew 13, verse 4, here we have, "And as he sowed, ento speirain." As he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside. So that seed falling, episen, is your main verb there. And notice the relation of the infinitive verbal concept of sowing. When did that happen? Well, it tells us that as he sowed, or while he sowed, or when he sowed. In other words, at the same time that he sowed, the seed was falling by the wayside. And so here you have, in the word speirain, you have a present active infinitive of speiro. And so the temporal adverbial infinitive can show prior time, it can show contemporaneous time, it can also show subsequent time. And when this is the case, the prepositions pra and the article to will be used, or even just the word prin plus an infinitive. And so the action of the infinitive occurs after the action of the main or controlling verb. In other words, the action of the main verb takes place before, that's how we're going to translate it, the action of the infinitive. And here's an example of this. John 8:58. Most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now in John 8:58, we have a very well-known ego eimi statement, an I am statement in John's gospel that indicates deity. And Jesus, of course, is saying more than the fact that he pre-existed Abraham. He's saying, I am the I am of the Old Testament. But our point is not so much to look at the ego eimi statement here, but to look at the infinitive use of genesthai, which is preceded by the word prin. And prin is translated before, but what we have here with genesthai is the aorist middle and passive deponent infinitive form of genomai, which means I become. And so this could literally be translated, before Abraham came to be, I am. Or it's more simply translated, before Abraham was, I am. But Jesus makes this point very strongly nonetheless. Now the fifth type of adverbial infinitive is the causal infinitive, and this is commonly used in the book of Luke and Acts. Luke seems to prefer using this, but you rarely will find it outside of those two books, so other writers don't prefer it like Luke does. And this causal infinitive is the use of the infinitive that communicates usually unintentional reason or ground for the action of the main and controlling verb. And it answers the question of why. Why did an action occur? It most often will use the construction dia ta, preposition and the article, plus the infinitive, dia ta plus infinitive, and is translated using because, since, or for plus the appropriate finite verb. And here's an example from James 4, verse 2. You do not have, why? Because you do not ask. And the Lord says, oftentimes you didn't bother to even ask me in prayer. Otherwise I would have given you something if you had not asked to consume it upon your own lusts, but that my will would be done is the idea. But here we have in James 4, verse 2, the infinitive aitesthai, which is from the word aiteo, meaning I ask. And so aitesthai is the present middle infinitive form of aiteo. Now you'll notice here as well that there is a second word for you in this context, humas, at the end there of the verse. And humas functions as the subject of the verbal idea in the infinitive of I ask, aiteo. And humas is in the accusative case, even though we might expect it as a subject of the idea of asking, you ask, we might expect it to be in the nominative case, but it's accusative. And there's a reason for that, because infinitives don't have person or number, and so again, they don't inherently have a subject built into them. Infinitives need to take their subject from the context somewhere. And here the word you is supplied as the subject, but it's in the accusative case. And when you see instances like this, where the infinitive is functioning this way, the subject will be a noun or a pronoun in the accusative case. And this is something that in our textbook by Summers he calls, I believe, the subject accusative. This is just an idiom or pattern of Greek usage that seems a little irregular, but it's something that is quite common. It's irregular in the way it's formed compared to what we've seen in the rest of Greek, but it's one of those strange idioms that Greek just has, and we have to get used to it. The subject accusative. Now our last type of adverbial infinitive is the infinitive of means. And this sometimes we'll use the prepositional phrase en to plus the infinitive, en and to. This is normally used to communicate contemporaneous time, or even a simple infinitive to convey the way in which the action of the controlling verb is performed. It answers the question of how. It is usually translated with the word by plus the infinitival form or verb in the form of a gerund, a verbal idea plus the ing ending. And here's an example of this from Acts 15, verse 10. Why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples? And you can see here in Acts 15:10 that we have the aorist active infinitive epitheni, which is from the verb epitithemi, to put or to place, or I put or place. And so you can see the word by in addition to the infinitive, but instead of a to construction, to put, here it's expressing means, and so we supply the word by in English, that English preposition, and that captures really the idea behind this phrase, this infinitival phrase in the Greek, or the use of the infinitive in Greek. I would say that this use of the infinitive is not nearly as common as the previous examples we've looked at. In fact, the infinitive of means is something that's quite rare in the New Testament. Now, moving from the adverbial uses of the infinitive, where it was used in relationship with a main or controlling verb, now we see that the infinitive can be used like a noun or noun phrase, something we call substantivally. And so here we have the first type of substantival infinitive, namely the subject infinitive. And here the infinitive functions as the subject or a predicate nominative of a finite verb or an implied verb. In such cases, the infinitive may be articular or anarthrous. Remember that the articular construction with an infinitive occurs only 300 times out of the 2,300 total times in the New Testament. And so when you have a subject substantival infinitive, it often will take an impersonal verb in the context, like eimi, de, existen, dake. Eimi meaning I am, of course, de meaning it is necessary, existen meaning it is right, and dake meaning think. These are often somewhere in the context. Now let's look at an example of a substantival infinitive that is a subject infinitive, one that you know well, this verse, Philippians 1:21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Now, it is true that Paul is expressing purpose here, but the type of construction is actually a subject infinitive. He uses this twice in this verse. To live and to die. Ta zain. Zain is the present active infinitive form of zao, a contract verb, by the way. And to die is ta apathanain. And apathanain is the aorist active infinitive form of apathnesko, to die. But you can see clearly that Christos in this passage and kurdos, Christ and gain, are both predicate nominatives, and the being verb is understood or supplied in our English translation, but it's understood in the Greek. And so the subjects in each case are going to be these two infinitive subject constructions. Now, even though here it uses the article in both cases, again, it doesn't have to have the article to function as a subject infinitive. There can also be the direct object usage as a substantival infinitive, and this is quite rare actually, but these do occur. And so the infinitive can not only function as the subject in a sentence, but it can also be a direct object. And here we have an example from Acts 25, verse 11. where Paul says, I do not refuse, subject, verb, and what is the object? To die. Ta epithane. Again, the aorist active infinitive form of apothnesko. Now, as a substantival infinitive, the infinitive can also be used in indirect discourse. This use of the infinitive involves verbs of speaking or perception to communicate indirect discourse, and by that I mean not a direct quotation in the first person. For example, we could say, he said, I am hungry. But in the third person, we would put it this way, as indirect discourse, he said that he was hungry, or simply, he said he was hungry. And in essence, we're rephrasing ourselves what somebody else said. That's indirect discourse. So in Greek, this meaning can be communicated by using a few different grammatical expressions or constructions, such as hati plus the indicative. We've already learned that in previous studies. We also know that hina plus a subjunctive can express this, or an anarthrous infinitive. Now just be aware that when the infinitive is used in indirect discourse, the sentence often can't be translated literally word for word. For example, 1 John 2 verse 6, you've probably already encountered this in your translation exercises to this point for that chapter. Ha legon en auto menein. This phrase could literally be translated, the one who says in him to abide. But such a translation makes little sense. Instead, we should render it this way, the one who says he abides in him, where the infinitive is translated as a third person indicative verb, he abides. The one who says he abides. When you have the indirect discourse use of a substantival infinitive, some of the most common verbs used with this type of infinitive will be dakeo, erotao, keliuo, krino, lego, nomidzo, parangelo, and parakoleo. And here we have an example of the indirect discourse use of the infinitive in Matthew 27 verse 58. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And here you have the verb keliuo, where it's ordered, and then you have the aorist passive infinitive form of apodidomi, apodathenai, apodathenai. The infinitive of indirect discourse is often just translated as a simple infinitive, to and then something. And by the way, in this phrase, the word to him is supplied in the context. So that was the indirect discourse use of the substantival infinitive. There's also the explanatory substantival infinitive. This use of the infinitive is sometimes labeled appositional or exegetical infinitive, where the infinitive just further defines a noun, pronoun, or adjective. In translation, you may need to supply a word like namely or that is as a qualifying phrase or term, or you could even just simply use a colon in front of the infinitive for what would follow. For example, we have in Revelation 2:14 where it says, who taught Balak, that is these Nicolaitan type people, these false teachers in the early church, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit fornication. And so Balaam is used as the example from the Old Testament who is similar to the Nicolaitans of the New Testament era that John is writing about. But notice here you have the verb to put, and that's balein, but it's further defined. Actually, the teaching, didasken, is further defined by the putting, balein, the eating, phagain, and the committing of fornication, par nousai. From the word porneia is the idea of sexual immorality. And so each of these terms, the putting, the eating, the sexual fornication, These are all exegetical, or they're appositional to the idea of the teaching that Balaam was doing. They further define or describe that teaching. And so what you can see here from this example is that this is an adjectival. It's a substantival infinitive, but you could also conclude from this that it's functioning adjectivally in the sense that it's modifying the word teaching. Now, to teach, or I teach, is a verb, but teaching by itself is a noun, and so these phrases are almost adjectival in their usage. So we've seen from these examples that the infinitive can function as a noun, adverb, participle with the infinitive of means, an adjective, a virtual adjective, and in the next example we'll see that it can also function as a verb. Here we have the independent infinitive. And I say independent in distinction to the substantival or adverbial uses of the infinitive, which we've looked at with all our previous examples. Here we have the independent infinitive because it's technically independent in its function from the rest of the sentence. Now, on a few occasions, the infinitive is going to function as an imperative, like a hortatory subjunctive. And in such cases, the infinitive is not dependent on any other verb, but is independent in the sentence. Let's give you an example here. Romans 12, verse 15. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Here you have the present active infinitive of kairo as well as klaio, to cry or cry out, and to rejoice. And so, in these instances, the infinitive is not related to any other verb in the sentence, and thus it's not an adverbial use of the infinitive. It's distinct from that. That's why we're categorizing it as an independent infinitive that is functioning like an imperative mood verb. Nor are the terms kairane and kliane functioning substantively here. They're truly independent and functioning like verbs. And in our last use of the infinitive, we're going to look at another independent type of infinitive called the absolute infinitive. And just like the previous example of an imperatival verb function, this use of the infinitive is also very rare in the New Testament. This one here occurs only about 5 times from my study, and the previous example of an imperatival verb usage of an infinitive only occurs a few times in the New Testament as well. But what is the absolute infinitive? This is the infinitive similar to the genitive absolute with participles, if you'll recall with those, that with the infinitive functioning independently of the rest of the sentence. Remember, the genitive absolute set the participle construction apart from the rest of the sentence so that it was separate. Now, it often will do that to emphasize that separate part of the sentence. That's the genitive absolute. But here with the infinitive, it can function in absolute separation from any syntactical relation to other words in the sentence. And this is most often found with the word kairane in the New Testament. And here's an example of this from James 1, verse 1. We see the introduction. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. So greetings, kairane, is entirely separate from the rest of the sentence. It's absolute in that regard. And that brings us to the end of our lesson and to the end of this course. I just want to say again that though I know these various uses are sometimes a little overwhelming to keep track of, that's why you have the summary chart on our Moodle course website that you can just use as a printout for your exegesis coming up. And I know it's difficult oftentimes to keep track of all the different possible uses of various parts of speech, But that's why I've introduced these to you in this course. I don't expect you to master them immediately, but you will need them as we move on to the very important subject in our studies of exegesis. All of this Greek, the way I've taught it, has been with the goal in mind of making you a more careful and accurate interpreter of Scripture and to prepare you for our next course in exegesis. And so I trust that you'll find these things helpful to that end.